Today's guest, writer and cultural historian Joseph Horowitz, is one of the most important voices on classical music in America. He is a former music critic with the New York Times and author of many books, including the recently published Propaganda of Freedom, and his new book, The Disciple, a Wagnerian tale of the Gilded Age, is available now. You can check the link below for that information. In addition to his writing, he hosts National Public Radio's series More Than Music. For many years, he has been producing historically contextualized programs with orchestras across the United States. Our conversation today centers on the state of our cultural life. As we experience the detrimental impact of social media and AI on our cognitive abilities and attention spans, what has been the effect on the performing arts? What role can music play in getting our world back on track? I'm honored to once again welcome Joseph Horowitz. Joe, welcome. It's so good to see you.
My pleasure, Thomas.
The last time we had an interview like this was in the midst of the pandemic. Um, and a lot has changed in the world since then. But specifically within the arts world, performing arts, what have you seen as the lasting impacts? What has gotten better and what has maybe gotten worse?
I don't think it's had any lasting impact. I think that what's had a lasting impact, at least in this country, is just the deterioration of our cultural life, which is ongoing. It was happening before the pandemic, it was happening during the pandemic, and it's happening now after the pandemic.
Deterioration of our cultural life, how so?
Well, people are not attentive to the arts. People don't talk about the arts. And I think my understanding of this deterioration is mostly as a deterioration of cultural memory. If you don't have cultural memory, you can't have a flourishing arts environment. And traditionally, creative artists have relied on the past, have relied on forebears, have relied on tradition, uh, have relied on cultural memory. And we now are losing touch with the past because of cell phones and social media and artificial intelligence. So this is a new situation. We've never experienced before or anything like it. What the long-term consequences will be, um, I was going to say you can't predict, but yet you can, in a sense, predict it just on the basis of the vectors in play. Things can only get worse because the driving force, the major problem is technology. And technology is not going to vanish from our world. And what does technology do? For one thing, it shortens attention spans. Well, the music that we love and we grew up with and that we promulgate depends on an attention span of some duration. Uh, you can't experience the Eroica Symphony, or even just the first movement of the Eroica Symphony, or even just the coda to the first movement of the Eroica Symphony, excuse me, without an attention span. If you're talking about Träumerei by Schumann, okay, fine. But if you're dealing with a sonata form, uh, it functions partly on the basis of memory, what the memory, what the ear remembers, what the brain processes. Why is the coda to the first movement of the Eroica so long? Why does it introduce a new theme? Because there's so much stuff that Beethoven has to deal with and resolve that we've already heard. And if you don't, if you can't experience that piece in time with sustained concentration, there's not a whole lot going for it. It's not about the tunes. It's not even about the ambience, the mood. I think it's fundamentally an exercise in structure. So I can't, I know a guy who used to teach in a major university in the United States who discovered that he could no longer teach sonata form to music students for this reason. Emanuele Arciulli, whom we both know, the Italian pianist, says a perfect example of an American piece would be music by Philip Glass or Steve Reich, where you don't really need to remember what happened before. It just evolves moment to moment. That's not to denigrate the music. It's just to situate it in in our own experience today.
That's part of the reason why I'm restarting my podcast from a very um, selfish reason. I'm trying to unplug my life, which seems ironic that I'm producing more content for the thing, for the machine, for the man. But I found in preparing for this interview um, that I'm dealing with this attention span issue. This has been something that's been going on in my life. I've noticed looking back. I don't listen to music anymore, Joe. I don't read like I used to. This is a real problem.
What's
And
what's intervening?
what was that?
What's intervening?
Intervening, what do you mean?
Well, you're living in Berlin, right?
That's right.
You go to concerts?
I do.
Well, then you're listening to music.
Yeah.
What do you mean you're not listening to music?
Not in the same way that I think only when I attend concerts do I listen to music typically. I don't include my preparation for concerts that I'm conducting
Mhm.
because of course I listen for those situations. But I mean, as a matter of curiosity,
Mm.
on my own time or for my own joyful purposes. I'm not, when I was a kid, I used to buy CDs, go to the CD shop. That was such a joy. My parents would bring me to the
Yeah, I
CD
can
shop.
tell you a story. I just heard Yvonne Fisher conduct Mahler 3 at Carnegie Hall, which is what, 90 minutes long? The hall was full. It was really a memorable performance. And it was really the first time I was able to take in the entirety of the symphony, partly because the performance was so well put together. And I wrote a blog in which I worried that conductors like Fischer and Manfred Honeck, who are based in tradition, are are increasingly rare. And I got a very interesting email from somebody who listens to a lot of recordings.
Hmm.
And he said, here are 12 recordings by conductors active in Europe right now who are major exponents of the Central European repertoire. The first was Ilyahu Inbal doing Mahler 5 with the Frankfurt Radio Orchestra. These are all YouTube links. So I went on YouTube and listened to Inbal, which means I listened to the opening of the first movement, the opening of the third movement, the opening of the fourth movement, and the end of the symphony. And I thought, yeah, this is really great. But I didn't listen to the whole symphony.
Really?
And similarly, with all these other YouTube links, there were so many of them. I listened to 2, 3, 4 minutes. This is something you can do today. Couldn't do it before. The idea of listening to bits and pieces, sampling a performance, sampling a symphony is almost irresistible right now.
Yeah,
And it's what you're talking about, right?
that's right. That's exactly right.
That's what I'm guilty. I just did it last night.
Well, I suppose that makes me
Well,
feel both better and worse.
I could tell you another story.
Yeah.
I took Maggie, who's 29 years old. My wife and I attended the concert with Maggie, who was visiting from San Francisco. And the symphony was new to her. So we listened to the last movement in its entirety on YouTube, conducted by Abato. Just as when we went, I took her to Bruckner 8 with Telemann in the Vienna Philharmonic a few years ago, and we listened to two movements in their entirety. So this is a counterexample
Mm.
where this was a very conscious attempt to do something different, which is listen to a sustained chunk of music at home off a television.
Yeah.
Whereas the temptation is to do just the opposite.
I,
And it is a fatal temptation.
It is a fatal temptation. Are you familiar with?
No way to listen to music. I use the example of the Eroica, but Mahler 3 is an even better example. Uh, you've got to swallow the whole thing or forget it.
Yeah.
It's not like Mahler 5 where you can enjoy the Adagietto, okay? Mahler 3, you either take it all or don't listen to it at all.
When I was a kid, I used to play along to recordings.
Oh, uh-huh. On your
Um,
channel.
yeah, and then
Yeah,
later conduct along,
yeah, sure.
and that interactive aspect was this led to this music being in a deeper part of me.
Yeah, sure.
Are you familiar with the term enshittification by
No,
um, let's see, I have a note here by
I
this
think
guy.
I've seen it, but no, no, not really.
Yeah, it's preparing after embarrassingly, I can't remember the guy's name. Yeah, Cory Doctorow is the author.
Yeah, okay.
Um, roughly speaking, enshittification is his model
Yeah,
theory
yeah,
that tries to understand the phenomena of how the internet interacts with our world and how we interact with internet applications.
yes,
So he uses examples like Amazon.
yes.
Amazon, when it was first formed back in, I believe it was the early 2000s, was this really cool thing. You could order books that were maybe hard to find in your local store and you could get them quickly and it was very convenient. And
I do it all the time.
yeah, and um, and so that's the first stage. Because it's a really great product, very friendly to the user. But then it becomes so popular that it becomes you're kind of stuck on the application. Think of Facebook, for example. It's very difficult to live without social media. It's possible
I
for
do. I do. I really do. I don't use social media. It hurts me professionally. I would have a much bigger audience if I did. I
yeah.
post my blogs on Facebook, but I don't correspond with anybody on Facebook. And as a result, I have very few followers on Facebook, and I'm not willing to make the effort to behave otherwise, even though I know that I could enlarge my audience. It's just
So
not.
it costs you in a certain way, but it seems like it also gives you a benefit.
I don't really have an option. I couldn't bring myself to behave otherwise. I spend my time, a lot of it writing without using AI. I mean, that's an even
Yeah.
better example. If I wanted to, I could take a shortcut and do my writing via AI. I'll tell you a story. This has just popped into my head because I'm writing a kind of a memoir. I've just, I have a book coming out. It's a novel about Anton Seidel
Mhm.
and Wagnerism in New York called The Disciple. I was interviewed by a guy from the BBC maybe a decade ago at the New York Philharmonic Archives. And the third participant in this conversation was Dino Francisconi. Gino Francisconi. Gino is the man responsible for creating the Carnegie Hall archives. It was a labor of love, a prodigious feat, and he had just digitized the archive. He was very proud of that. And I found myself saying that I regretted that he had digitized the archive. It had become too accessible. And the story I told was that I learned about Anton Seidel and Wagnerism in New York in the 1880s and 1890s, mainly by visiting two archives that were not digitized or even cataloged. One was at Columbia University and one was at the Brooklyn Historical Society. And the only way to use them was by physically handling these materials and looking and discovering what was there. One thing I discovered, which I'll never forget, was a letter that Zeidel wrote in pencil in his own hand. It was a speech that he was going to give at Brighton Beach, where he conducted in the summers. about how important it was that music be democratically shared. Had never been any record of this speech. I didn't find any reference to it in the newspapers. Uh, I was the first person to ever discover that this document existed, and it was I was holding it in my hand. My intimate communion with Zeidel, as a result of holding his letters and other documents such as this, created a bond. I felt as if I got to know him. And ultimately, that led to the writing of this novel. It could never have happened if I were dealing with screens. I would never have written the novel. I would never have acquired a feeling of intimacy with this man who died in the 1890s had I been using screen. It's a game changer.
Joe, you're making me think about, it's going to sound ridiculous, hipsters.
Okay, what about him?
My understanding of hipsters and my experience with hipsters
Yeah.
was from being an undergraduate and wanting to be a hipster myself and hanging out with hipsters. That was just sort of the crowd that I thought was cool. But you make me think of the the, the countercultural aspect of hipsterism, if you can. This idea that the real experience is somehow countercultural now. The experience that you had holding someone's letters in a very
Yeah,
intimate way.
yeah,
And I've been seeing, ironically, on the internet, lots of contributors and writers, content creators talking about unplugging their life and trying to advise people about strategies to do that because it's not so easy. Um, I was just in Dussmann. I don't know if you've been to Berlin or if you've heard of Dussmann, this great bookstore in Berlin.
no, I don't know about it.
It's I go there. It's my score shop. If I need to buy a score, it's quite likely that they have it. It's an incredible brick and mortar place right in the center of Berlin, and they also have an English bookstore section. And I went there and I saw about two or three books prominently displayed talking about unplugging your life. So something's happening. People are starting to notice this. I've been seeing commentators and scientists talking about the effect of AI and using AI for writing has on our brain and our learning abilities. I've noticed this myself, having used AI, that um, it it really affects the way that I interact with the world. Um, what advice do you have for people in my generation right now, faced with this situation?
This is a weighty question, and I'm also the parent of two children. I think you're fortunate to be in Berlin, I'd say that.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there's much more continuity culturally in Berlin than there is in the United States, especially right now. I don't know if I am competent to presume to be able to answer that question. I can tell you that this is redundant. I have not lifted a finger to acquire an audience on Instagram or Facebook or Meta. I don't even deal with these services other than Facebook, where as I said, I post my blogs, but I'm not a correspondent. I don't pay any attention to what anybody else says. It's just there if you want it. So I made no effort to cultivate an audience through social media. I have a blog which is read sometimes in considerable numbers and sometimes not. Um, I guess for me, the blog is mainly an exercise in self expression rather than an exercise in communication. I just wrote a blog, okay, about my experience hearing Ivan Fischer conduct Mahler 3 and my experience of hearing Manfred Honeck conduct the suite from Electra. And ultimately, it was about tradition and lineage and what will happen as we have fewer and fewer conductors or soloists who belong to a tradition, a national tradition, French tradition, a Russian tradition. And I mentioned the young, the 23-year-old Spanish violinist, Dueñas, I forget her first name, who performed the Beethoven Concerto with Honeck, and she's recorded it with Honeck. So this is a girl who's a huge talent. And I wish her well, and I hope she has a major career. She already has a major career. She can do anything she wants with the violin, and she's original. You can't place her. Her Beethoven Concerto doesn't remotely resemble any version you've ever heard. So what do you do with such an artist? At one extreme, say Lang Lang, it could be just a self-indulgence. But this woman is not, she doesn't strike me as self-indulgent. I think her Beethoven performance is very deeply felt. And I'm also impressed by these two Koreans who are very popular right now, Yoon Shan Lin and Cho. I'm sorry, I forget his first name. I heard Mr. Cho play the Rhapsody on a Theme by Paganini with the Pittsburgh Symphony very recently, and I thought it was just staggering. I was deeply moved by it. Other people in the audience were turned off by it. It didn't sound like Rachmaninoff. And I wrote in my blog that this phenomenon will either lead to a refreshment or a dilution. Okay. So it would be nice if I could foster a conversation with such a blog. I've gotten 3 or 4 responses that were very substantive. Well, 1 or 2 of them actually are posted publicly. The others were just emails from people who were deeply engaged by this issue and see it as crucial. However, since I've never done anything to cultivate a following, I don't see that I'm able to engender a fruitful conversation on a topic that seems to me absolutely vital. And indeed, if I were to plug myself in order to attempt to enlarge that conversation, I have no confidence that it would work. I mean, it requires, first of all, a certain degree of initiation on the part of the people who are conversing. And I sometimes get very angry and vituperative responses to things that I write from people who just have no sympathy for or understanding of where I'm coming from. And they are numerous because I'm not woke. And I don't think social justice is what the arts are about. So the possibility for a larger conversation seems to me pretty toxic at the moment. The more you enlarge the conversation, the more you risk cancel culture and other forms of toxicity. So it's a conundrum, and I'm torn between feeling hopeless and just feeling impelled to continue to produce concerts and write books as I have done for half a century. But that's an answer that's not an answer.
Yeah, I hear. I mean, Joe, from my own personal experience, I can only speak from my experience. You've had a huge impact on me. The work, particularly the work that I know you from South Dakota. This is how we
Yeah,
met back in the day,
of
and
course. Yeah,
it was probably 2018, Copeland in Mexico, first program that I was a part of as assistant conductor at the South Dakota Symphony. I remember that fondly because I went to Walmart and got poster supplies and acted
Yes,
as a as a
right.
as a as a communist protester that interrupts the
Yeah, I was
performance.
one of them too. Right. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And and moving on to Dvorak in America, um, Lou
But
Harrison.
where does that lead, Thomas? Do you see other orchestras other than the South Dakota Symphony producing programming of that kind? Uh, we're lucky in South Dakota to have a music director who's a visionary,
Yeah,
Delta David Geyer. I was talking to him an hour ago, and I told him that I was going to be seeing you.
yeah.
But David is completely committed to doing programming that will consciously connect with the audience and the community at hand. And he's creative and he's sincere. Um, I think Yvonne Fisher is, with much broader impact, is doing the same kind of thing. But in the United States, I don't really have opportunities. My next project is with the University of Michigan Symphony Orchestra, where the conductor Ken Kiesler is very much on board, attempting strategies of the kind that we're discussing for the reasons that we're discussing them. But by and large, it's not happening. There is no real creative and substantive response to the crisis at hand. The crisis will just seemingly unfold without being addressed.
Well, if I
You
can do
can
anything
address
about
it.
it,
Yeah, you're a conductor.
yeah,
You have an opportunity to do something about it against immense odds. As we both know, it took David Geyer 20 years to implement the Lakota Music Project. 20 years.
yeah.
Uh, and he didn't delegate that. He did it all himself. So it's an exemplary case of the kind of response that the cultural crisis demands. I just don't see it happening elsewhere. Dudamel, when he takes over the New York Philharmonic, will have no other music directorships. He'll be living in New York. He's very committed to music education. He wants to get the orchestra out of Lincoln Center. So that's an opportunity which he's going to attempt to seize. I I don't know what will happen. I went to his concert at Radio City, and that was like a first step in getting the orchestra off the campus in Lincoln Center. And he programmed a lot of Bernstein. And you'd think that would be the right thing to do at Radio City. Excerpts from West Side Story, On the Town, and Wonderful Town, all of which are Broadway musicals about New York City. And my experience of that concert was that to discover that Bernstein's New York no longer exists and Bernstein's Broadway no longer exists. So you have Bernadette Peters coming out singing a song from Wonderful Town, which is called the conga. Everybody's dancing the conga. First of all, nobody dances the conga anymore. It was a craze in the 50s, but nobody even knows about it anymore. And the very witty lyrics by Adolph Green and um, what is it, Betty Comden are a cultural inventory from the 50s. So here, Dudamel was doing Bernstein in an attempt to connect to Radio City and to New York, only to discover that the connection no longer exists. And the audience, the cultural community that Bernstein enjoyed no longer exists. I heard Bernstein conduct at Central Park, a program of Gershwin and Bernstein, and the lawn was full. And uh, it was an immense sense of occasion and of cultural community. Nothing like that could happen now. We don't even know what New York City is. What's the identity of New York City right now? We have a new mayor. He's a socialist. Okay. Um, but and this is partly about technology and the internet and people staying at home and not congregating and not talking. Uh, Dudamel, his first challenge is going to be, okay, what is New York? David came to Sioux Falls and he decided, okay, what's distinctive about South Dakota? Got it. Native Americans. What's distinctive about New York at this moment? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows.
This is, I have to push back just slightly. The idea
Good.
of identifying the culture of New York when New York is such a big, diverse place. I mean, maybe that is what it is, the culture. The fact that it is a huge, ungainly,
Doesn't help. I mean, it's always been true.
yeah.
It's not, it's it's not specific enough. Uh, Bernstein's New York was partly about a community of culture. It was largely Jewish, middle-aged, with roots in Central Europe. Okay, it's gone. I used to work at the 92nd Street Y in the 1980s. That was an audience that was German Jewish. It was the descendants of these German Jews who came from Germany to the United States in love with Beethoven and Brahms, uh, lieder concerts. Uh, that audience is gone. And that was a very distinctive audience. Um, it was something concrete that you could address. The Philharmonic audience now, I go to those concerts and it's a very responsive audience, but I really have no idea who these people are. Uh, and you can't tell. They're generally enthusiastic. Carnegie still gets a very good audience, especially if they do Russian music. The Russians come out. That's the best audience in New York right now for music and theater. People whose native language is Russian, who come from Russia, who attend with their families. I went to a concert at Town Hall by a famous Iranian musician who plays, I forget what it's called. The place was packed with Iranians of every age. That was impressive. And he played for 75 minutes continuously without a word said, and the audience was rapt. So that was a distinctive audience. I could see that there was a cultural community. Um, how is Dudamel going to forge a cultural community? He's going to try, which is more than his predecessors did. Certainly, Lauren Mazel never tried to do that. Certainly, Jaap van Sweden never tried to do that. I wish him well.
I want to come back to a specific line you just mentioned about the difference between communication and self-expression. What is that difference?
Did I say something about communication versus self-expression?
Yeah, you mentioned within the context of your blog that your blog, your intention of your blog is more about self-expression, less about communication.
Oh, well, I have not done anything to cultivate an audience for my blog, if or my Facebook postings. In other words, I don't converse on Facebook, for instance. So all I do, it's kind of selfish, is post my blogs for people who care to read them. Quite a few people read them, although very few people respond. So I would like to foster a conversation because I feel that the topics we're talking about are important, but I'm not willing to take the time away from other things to do what you're supposed to do in order to build an internet audience. And I don't do Instagram and I don't do Meta and whatever else other people do. All I do is file a blog and post a blog on Facebook and send the blog to a bunch of people that I know. And sometimes the blog is widely read, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I get interesting responses, especially people who email me privately
Yeah.
and say things that they're not willing to say publicly. And then I will have a correspondence with them. Sometimes they're people I know, sometimes they're people I don't know. But the conversation we're having should be a much larger conversation. The topics we're talking about should be talked about in a sustained and informed and meaningful way, and they're not. Partly because the institutions of culture, at least the institutions of classical music, do nothing, so far as I'm aware, to foster such a conversation. Certainly in New York, the Metropolitan Opera and New York Philharmonic have not been institutions, or Carnegie Hall, that were invested in having a conversation. For instance, if the Met, when it mounts Porgy and Bess, this is our most important American opera. I would say it's the highest achievement in American classical music. And yet it's very controversial and remains remarkably misunderstood. People don't know even the basics, like who wrote it? Who wrote the libretto? Uh, what's it based on? What was Porgy the play? What was Porgy the novella? What were the original reviews like? What was the original response? What's its performance history? How does it speak to us today? It should be a no-brainer if the Met mounts a new production, Porgy and Bess, to create some kind of a forum for informed conversation. It could involve Wayne Shirley, who did the critical edition, or Mr. Robinson, who did the production, or the singers who are singing Porgy and Bess, or various other music historians, such as myself. I've written an entire book about Porgy and Bess, to ponder what it says to us today and what it says about American culture generally, that our most important product in classical music, our most important creative product, is both unfinished and controversial.
Mm.
You could say the same about the United States, that it's unfinished and controversial. But the Met, under its current leadership, is simply not equipped to do that. It's the kind of thing I always tried to do when I was running orchestras. My biggest success was at BAM, at Brooklyn Academy of Music in the 1990s. I was handed an exemplary audience by Harvey Lichtenstein. These were people who wanted to think, who wanted to talk, who were culturally sophisticated, uh, who were worried about the future of the arts. And if we had a conversation, it could last for an hour. And everybody would be raising their hand and contributing. And it was really great. Uh, I've never known that anywhere else because there's never been another Harvey Lichtenstein. He created that audience. And he created it very consciously by creating programming that could not be experienced at Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center. That was his strategy. And people came in droves. So the Public Theater under Joe Papp was such a place too. It's kind of a performing arts institution, to my knowledge, doesn't exist today. Maybe it does someplace outside of New York, but I'm not aware of it.
I want to talk about in this interview, basically, we're circling around the issue, something that I've been struggling to put into words. I feel it in my heart, but I don't. I don't know how to articulate it, and I'm not even exactly sure how to articulate the audience that I want to articulate it to. Maybe you can help me. Background: I grew up in Houston, Texas. My father was a music educator in a previous career. He then switched into science, but he raised us going to the Houston Symphony.
Yeah.
And in the 90s, there was a work stoppage. I forget if it was a lockout or a strike, but um, my father got involved with the musicians. Uh,
That's when Larry Foster was the music director, right?
this was during Eschenbach's tenure, at the very
Oh,
end of
it's amazing.
Eschenbach's tenure.
Oh,
Yeah. Um, Houston Symphony was my first time seeing an orchestra. One of my most formative musical memories was seeing Christoph Eschenbach conduct Tristan in Isolde in a dress rehearsal at the Houston Grand Opera with the Houston Symphony in the pit.
yeah, yeah,
I was 8 years old. I could only,
yeah,
it was a school night. I only went to the first
yeah,
act.
yeah, yeah,
Um, that music still is inside me now.
yeah,
I finally saw Tristan in complete form only a few months ago at the Deutsche Oper, um, which tells you a little bit about the access to opera, of course, in our country, in the United States.
yes, it does.
So I bring up the this experience of my childhood of work stoppages because these musicians that my dad and my mom became familiar with, they were over in our house at dinner. We were hanging out with them after rehearsals, in concerts. We went and visited them in music festivals in the summer. These orchestra musicians were my heroes. They're one of them is the reason why I play the cello. I wanted to be just like Chris.
Yeah,
And there were two labor issues, work stoppages that I remember in my childhood. And both of those, I had such a fear that I would be losing these heroes of mine, that they would no longer have a job, that they would audition
yeah,
someplace else. So I've understood that this great thing that I so desperately love, music, you can't take it for granted, that you have to fight for it. And as a child, you don't understand why don't more people like this? I was the weird kid at school who liked classical music, you know?
yeah,
Sure, that's probably a common thing in a lot of my audience. Um, I've had entrepreneurial stints. I started a music festival in Northwest Iowa, and I ran it for about 5 years. It was a chamber music festival. Um, and in my job at the South Dakota Symphony, particularly as music director, I'm building a program. Um, but Joe, what are the arts for? Like, I think I know, I think I feel that, but can you help me articulate this? Like, what you talk about cultural memory and culture. Uh, what is that, and why do we need orchestras?
Well, partly I think the arts are an instrument for self-understanding, national understanding, and mutual understanding. And one of the reasons that we're so screwed up right now in all those categories is that the arts are fading from the American experience. Um, David will tell you that when all else fails, if you can't get some kind of mutual understanding going between Native Americans and non-Native Americans in South Dakota, what's the last resort? It's going to be music. Uh, that's also a truism in diplomacy, soft diplomacy. What worked in the Cold War more than anything else? It was music that helped Russians and Americans find common ground. One of my books is The Propaganda of Freedom, which is about the cultural Cold War. And when I went to the New York Philharmonic Archives and looked at the material there about Bernstein's visit in '59 with the New York Philharmonic in Leningrad and Moscow and Kiev, it's really impressive to revisit his cultural ambassadorship. He was very, very proactive. He was fearless. He was completely committed to this ideal that music would foster mutual understanding. At that moment, this is all in my book, the Americans were pursuing the cultural Cold War tendentiously, uh, adversarially. They were demonizing the Soviet Union. They were telling the world Soviet Union is a cultural wasteland. Well, that was bad propaganda because, for one thing, it wasn't true. And it was bad propaganda because it was obnoxious. What Bernstein did is he didn't go there to say, we're better than you. He went there to say, we're the same as you. And it wasn't implicit, it was completely explicit. He talked about it. And he was eager to share American music and eager to perform the music of Shostakovich because he felt Shostakovich was an immensely important composer at a time when a lot of people in the West were treating him like a stooge or a simpleton. So this encapsulates an answer to your question. There are many answers to your question. And it's not even a question that's necessarily a fruitful question, because the arts are not a, a practical remedy. They're not practical, they're visionary. And yet one can say, certainly in my case, my personal identity would be much different, minus the arts. Uh, the environment in which I grew up or the environment in which I raised a family would be fundamentally different without the arts. I do think the arts are human.
I want to point to a specific passage from your book, Propaganda of Freedom, which I've been recently rereading
Yeah,
about Shostakovich. I've been encountering a lot of Shostakovich lately.
yeah. Well,
Um,
he's a timely composer. There's no question about it.
how so? What makes him timely? I
I just
agree, but
talked to David Geyer. Uh, John Andrea Noseda just conducted Shostakovich Eighth Symphony with the National Symphony at the Kennedy Center. It was serendipitous. I think it was already scheduled. You should read Philip Kennicott's review in the Washington Post, in which he talks about how appropriate the symphony was to the occasion at hand. Here is an orchestra that's essentially been manhandled by the president, who's now going to close the Kennedy Center for 2 years. They've lost their audience, they've lost their donors, at least the traditional donors. And here's a concert that was full, featuring a piece of music that serendipitously seemed to suit the occasion and express defiance rather than capitulation. It was a concert that would have had a completely different temper had it not been for the selection of this symphony for this occasion. And we're about to do it in South Dakota too, in a few weeks. Shostakovich 8. Shostakovich 8 is a composer whose entire mission is bearing witness. That's what he's about. He's a people's artist, and he's bearing witness on behalf of Russian people to the situation at hand, whether it's Stalin or World War II. He had immense impact on a cultural community and is not lost even on Americans today. Those, those pieces retain their impact, even if they're bearing witness to something that's past. And of course, it's past and it's not. The situations to which Shostakovich bore witness would never be literally replicated. But, in spirit, Stalin was not the last. World War II was not the last. He's addressing human travail that's permanent, permanent part of the human condition.
I've been spending a lot of time with the music of Shostakovich lately, just
Yeah,
because of certain conducting opportunities. I recently conducted the Deutsche Symphonische Orchester DSO Berlin in a masterclass,
yeah,
Shostakovich First Symphony,
yeah,
and soon I'll be conducting the 12th Symphony of Shostakovich.
yeah.
Um, there, there's an interesting motive in the First Symphony of Shostakovich that, if my memory serves me right, first appears in the third movement. Are you familiar with this piece?
I know the First Symphony. Yeah.
Yeah. There's this fanfare figure that appears in the in the third movement. Bum, ba-da-dum, bum,
Um,
bum.
yes. In
Yeah.
the temple.
And it first appears in the just the trumpets, horns, timpani, almost as a dead end
Hmm.
in the third movement.
Yeah.
The third movement is the Langsamer Satz,
Hmm.
the Tristan infused
Yeah.
romantic, hyper romantic, and there's these long paragraphs of music that are building momentum, and then it encounters this almost, it seems like a dead end. Bum, ba-da-da-dum, bum, bum.
In the temple.
Yeah, but the timpani brings it back in the fourth movement.
Oh, is that in the fourth movement? Yeah.
Yeah, the solo you're thinking about,
Hmm.
and the music in the fourth movement and the finale is very fast tempo. In fact, maybe
Yeah.
the tempo that Shostakovich writes, some would argue is unplayable. Um, and then all of a sudden it stops, and we hear silence, and then a timpani solo, bum, ba
Right.
bum, 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 as if we're reconsidering an idea that was a dead end,
Hmm.
and now it actually starts gaining strength. It was a timpani, and now it's the flutes, and now it's more and more people. You talk about Shostakovich bearing witness. I mean, this is maybe I'm crafting a narrative that isn't there in the symphony because it's just, it's absolute work. But we do know that Shostakovich was had a predilection to programmatic music, to cinematic writing. He played in theaters, the organ, to silent films. It just feels like that this is like a revolutionary moment, that it starts with one voice and then something can gather steam. And from my own standpoint, through what I've been seeing in the news and reading about around the world, friends in Iran, friends in America, friends in Ukraine, this motive gives me hope. I don't know what to do with that. Other than tell people about it and try to perform it. Um, Something about Shostakovich that you wrote, I believe it was a quote by Shostakovich, that the artist in the USA is free not to matter.
That's
So,
me.
you said that?
I wrote that.
Okay, that's a good quote. So you talk about the
I talked about
dichotomy,
Stravinsky being free not to matter in Los Angeles,
free not to matter in L.A. Stravinsky.
in a
So
vacuum. He's not, he doesn't have a community.
so you're talking about, in your book Propaganda of Freedom, one of the main theses is about the the life and plight of the artist in the Soviet Union versus the life and plight of the artist in the
Yeah, I
USA.
say that there are trade-offs in both situations.
Yeah,
There are strengths and weaknesses about the Soviet arts and the American arts, and you can't really say one is better than the other. They're both very, very badly flawed.
right. So let's iterate on that. So the Soviet experience, obviously, you could be killed if you write the wrong thing.
Yeah, and you get a salary, and your music is published, and your music is performed, your music is noticed, and there's a big audience for it. And nobody's going to kill you in the United States or tell you what to do, but you can be completely ignored.
And it seems like the American way of doing things was through commercialism, right? You've talked about Toscanini's impact.
Yes, we commercialized. I A chapter in that book deals with the popularization of classical music in Russia versus the US during the interwar decades. And again, it's a trade-off. In Russia, there were limitations on what music you could perform. There were ideological constraints, ideological verdicts, and yet you had factories with opera companies, factories with orchestras, factories with choruses. You had an emphasis on native music, on new music. In the United States, um, there were no such restrictions, but there were no opera companies and factories, and there were no orchestras and factories. And it was a commercial enterprise, mainly uh, under the thumb of David Sarnoff, RCA and NBC, the recordings, the radio broadcast, the primers, an enormous library of music appreciation books. And in all of this propaganda, there was nothing much to be said about new music or American music. So the Americans did certain things right and certain things wrong, and the Russians did other things right and other things wrong. The Russians wound up, though, preserving an audience. Certainly, it was conventional wisdom then. I don't know what's happened since the fall of communism, but Americans like Byron Janis or Van Cliburn who went abroad during the Cold War were astonished by Russian audiences.
I'm seeing a bit of that here in Germany. I've been living now in Germany for about a year and a half.
Yeah,
And going to a lot of performances.
yeah.
Berlin is an incredible place. Just this week, let's see, what have I seen? I saw Violante, the
Check it.
Korngold opera when he wrote when he was 18 years old,
Oh,
um, at the Deutsche Oper.
yeah.
The next day, I saw Lohengrin at the Staatsoper.
Yeah.
Um, then I went to a general dress rehearsal of Gurlieder, also with the Deutsche Oper at the Philharmonie.
Wow. Who conducted Girl Eater?
It was Donna Chronicles. And I'm assuming I've never lived in New York, but I'm assuming New York is a similar type of ecosystem where this is possible. But
But
I,
we don't have Lohengrin. We don't have Girl Eater.
mm,
We don't have Corn Gold. None of that stuff.
let
How
alone in 3 days.
how are the audiences?
This is interesting. So I make a point at actually at looking at the audiences and
Yeah.
um, the the vibes are different, obviously, from the Deutsche Oper to the Staatsoper. Um, but they were both very well attended. I think there's obviously a lot of Wagner in Germany, which makes sense. Um, but it seems to sell well, and um, Deutsche Oper seems to be a bit. Hmm, people aren't dressed as fancy as they are at the Staatsoper.
Is it intergenerational, the audience?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, there are more folks over the age of 50 than there are under 50. Um, but yeah, the seats are surprisingly full, I have to
Mhm.
say. All of that just underneath the umbrella. Now we're just last year, I believe the city of Berlin cut arts funding by 13%. So this is the main difference between the United States and a place like Germany. The United States, the arts have to be funded. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but to my audience, I'm saying have to be funded by private donations mainly. We can talk about the NEA and NEH, which both of us have worked for and been involved with. But that's pennies on the dollar compared to the arts funding that happens here in Germany. Every small little town has, it seems like it has its own theater. If not, some of them even have full-time opera companies and ballet companies in a town that would be comparable in size to Sioux Falls. So we're talking in the hundreds of 200,000 population. I'm really worried that we're going to lose this year in Germany. That for economic reasons, funding is going to be cut, and I'm starting to realize that part of what I can contribute to this society, hopefully, is bringing some of the work that we've done in the United States to try to keep our funding, trying to make certain things relevant, and going out in the community. A lot of the stuff I've learned from South Dakota Symphony, music education. Have you done much research in the funding models in Europe versus the United States in current day Europe?
No, I just know what everybody else knows, which is A, there's a lot more state support, and B, it's diminishing, and there's an effort to try and appropriate the American model of private philanthropy, but that's a failed model. So uh, it's a struggle in both places. And of course, the funding in Germany is incomparably
Yeah,
greater.
yeah. Joe, let's talk actually about you a bit more. Two questions. Can you talk about your background and how it led you to this life of the arts? And secondly, what would you like your legacy to be?
These are weighty questions, Thomas. The first thing I would say is that I experienced a sense of betrayal when I was at the New York Times in the 1970s and discovered that the concert life of New York was moribund. Because I grew up thinking that classical music was vibrant and indispensable, and I could see that it was dying. So this impelled me to try to figure out why, and I became a historian of American classical music, focusing on institutional history, which had been very little studied. And we've been talking about that, how the popularization of classical music was mishandled in the United States. So I wound up pursuing at least two different careers. One was as a historian, looking at the history of classical music in the United States and the failed attempt to dig roots. It was initially very auspicious, but then it went awry after World War I. I've created this entire narrative, which is personal to me, about the rise and fall of classical music in America. Uh, I don't think people care about it very much. It would be nice if they did, because I think many lessons can be learned about what happened that was good and what happened that was bad, and unfulfilled promise. Uh, I think the 1880s and the 1890s, especially in New York, marked the apex of classical music in the United States. So I've left 14, 15, 16 books on this topic. It would be nice if they were adequately noticed and discussed. Uh, the other thing I've done is attempted to explore new ways of presenting music in concert that would address the crisis and the dwindling audience through contextualized programming and a kind of educational effort that's very unusual among orchestras. Orchestras have satellite education departments that produce young people's concerts. I'm interested in using the main subscription concerts to create partnerships with universities and conservatories. It's hard to do. Depends on who's around. In South Dakota, we're lucky because we have guys like David Ernest and David Reynolds at South Dakota State who are ready and willing. So we have a great educational partnership there, even though that campus is an hour away. That's a template that has failed to thrive. I've pursued it since the 1990s, and I've produced such programming, often with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, all over the country, east, west, north, south. And the only place where it's become permanent is Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where it works because of Delta David Geyer, who's the music director. It worked for a time in El Paso because Frank Candelario was the associate provost of the University of Texas, El Paso, and a member of the board of the El Paso Symphony. When he left, that was the end. It's worked to a degree in Buffalo because of Joanne Folletta, who's the music director of the Buffalo Philharmonic. Right now, it's working at the University of Michigan because of two people, Mark Clegg, who runs the arts initiative there, and Ken Kiesler, who conducts the orchestra there. And we'll see what happens with the Mahler Festival this spring, and whether it leads to other such attempts to contextualize music for the student orchestra. I mean, here's a conservatory orchestra that plays better than just about any professional orchestra because the players are not jaded. How can you get them to feel Mahler's Sixth? It's not in their blood. So we're conducting an experiment, which includes the production of a play, which I wrote, and a first rehearsal dedicated purely to discussion and conversation, and a concert format that's exactly what we do in South Dakota, which begins with a half-hour scripted presentation. How efficacious will this be at a major conservatory of music is an excellent question, and perhaps we'll be able to answer it.
Well, your model of concert programming has been hugely influential on me, and I'm with your blessing, I'm looking for ways to carry on the torch here,
Yeah, well,
especially in Germany.
very few people have the desire or the capacity to do what David has done. I've done everything I can to publicize what's happened in South Dakota. Alex Ross writes about it. The New York Times has done 2 stories about it. It's sitting there as a success story for anybody who's interested in how to make classical music, quote, relevant. There it is. It works. But I don't think there's sufficient interest elsewhere in what it is and why it works and how this model can be adopted, because it can be adopted.
Well, going back to our conversation about Shostakovich's First Symphony and that motive that starts to build strength.
Yeah, yeah.
This is a hopeful note that we can end on. Many thanks to Joseph Horowitz for sharing his time with us. Make sure to check out his books, blog, and radio series linked below. I want to acknowledge the somewhat pessimistic nature of our conversation today. We must be honest with ourselves. Social media and AI are causing us harm. I feel it, and you probably feel it too. And the irony of talking about it here on a social media platform is not lost on me. But what should we do about it? The preservation of art and culture is inextricably linked to the survival of our species. As the author Neil Postman wrote, we are entertaining ourselves to death. The kind of music that Joe and I talked about today is not entertainment. In fact, I would say it's the antidote to entertainment. Writing this music, playing this music, hearing this music, talking about this music, it's a search for meaning, for truth, for something real, not for this constant distraction that we hold in our hands every day. I know that many of you out there are yearning for something greater. Come to a concert, read a book, draw a picture, write an essay, go to a museum, take a walk in nature. Just turn off your phone for a little while. As I mentioned in our interview, I see hopeful signs. People are starting to rebel against these forces that are numbing our minds. But we've got an uphill battle. Let's get to work. Until next time, thanks for watching, and be well.